In the summer of 1932, in Logan County, West Virginia, a radiator repairman named Marshall Cletus Biles stood in a garden patch behind his shop and did something no plant breeder in this country had told him he was allowed to do. His shop sat at the bottom of a long mountain grade, the kind of grade that boils a truck engine dry by the top. That is why he was a radiator man. Trucks came down that hill steaming, and he fixed them. He had a sixth-grade education. He had never read a paper on genetics in his life. And he had decided he was going to grow the biggest tomato in the state of West Virginia. So he planted one German Johnson in the middle of a circle. He ringed that circle with 3 other varieties, and every morning for a season he took a baby's ear syringe and moved pollen from the ring into the center by hand. He saved seed off the best fruit. Next spring he planted that seed and did it again and again. 6 years. 6 seasons of one man in a mountain garden with a rubber syringe, chasing something. By 1940 he had it. Fruit running 2.5 pounds and better, some of them over 3. He started selling the plants out of the back of his shop for $1 apiece, which in Logan County during the Depression was an outrageous price for a tomato plant, and people drove 200 miles up those mountain roads to hand him the dollar anyway. In 6 years, he paid off the mortgage on his house, $6,000, gone. The neighbors started calling the tomato the mortgage lifter, and you can still buy the seed today under that exact name, 90-some years later, out of a catalog. Now here is the part of that story that gets told wrong every single time it gets told. It gets told as a story about a seed, a miracle seed, the lucky cross, buy the right variety and the ground does the rest. But look at what the man actually was. He was not an agronomist. He was a radiator man. And a radiator man understands one thing in his bones that a whole lot of gardeners never learn in 50 years of trying. It is not how much water is in the system that matters. It is whether the flow is steady. A radiator with plenty of water in it will still crack a block if that water surges and starves. Heat spike, cold shock, heat spike. Steady is the whole game. And that, neighbor, is the actual answer to why your tomatoes are small. Here is the twist, and I want you to sit with it, because it undoes about 9/10 of what you have been sold every May of your adult life. A ripe tomato is roughly 95% water. 95. It is not mostly nutrient. It is not mostly minerals. It is a bag of water with flavor dissolved in it, which means the size of your fruit, the thickness of the wall, whether the bottom rots out, whether the skin splits the day after a thunderstorm, whether the blossoms set at all in the 3rd week of July, almost every one of those outcomes traces back to one variable, not soil, not seed, not fertilizer. Whether water reached that fruit at a steady rate, day after day, without a single hard swing. And the reason your plants cannot do that is not your fault, and it is not your rainfall. It is that on the day you set them out, you gave them a root system 4 inches deep and then asked them to survive an Appalachian August on it. That is the real enemy. Shallow roots. That is the lost skill. Not a fertilizer, not a trick, not a product. The old people on these ridges planted a tomato in a way that built a drought-proof root system before the plant ever had a leaf on it, and then they defended that root system with 3 or 4 things that cost nothing. And when a 2-week dry spell came through in the middle of August, the kind that flattens a modern raised bed in 72 hours, their plants did not even notice. Ask yourself this honestly. If it did not rain on your garden for 18 days this August, and your county went under a burn ban, and you were watering out of a bucket, would you get a crop? Most people reading these words would lose the whole patch. Their great-grandmothers would have canned 100 quarts off that same ground in that same dry year. That is the gap, and we are closing it today. I am Solomon Mercer, 7th generation on Mercer Ridge in the southern Appalachians. My people came in through the gaps in the 1790s with seeds sown into the hem of a coat, and they have not left this ground since. My grandfather Amos kept a garden ledger from the year he was married until the winter he passed, a hardback account book with the columns ruled for money that he used instead for planting dates, weather, yields, and which row disappointed him. He wrote in pencil so he could argue with himself later. Before he died, he made me promise the ledger would not go in a box in an attic. This is me keeping that promise. There are 7 pieces to planting a tomato the old way. 7 in order. Miss the first one and nothing else you do the rest of the summer can fix it, because the window closes the minute you fill in the hole. Miss the fourth and you will lose the bottom half of the plant to a disease that lives in your own dirt. But the 7th piece, the last one, is the one that got taken clean out of American households inside a single generation. There is a whole body of law around the 7th piece. Real law on the books that I will name and date for you, and it is the one that turns a garden from a hobby you pay for every spring into something that belongs to you. 2 more things before we get in. The 3rd piece is why your great-grandmother buried a cracked clay pot in the ground beside every hill of tomatoes, and it is a technique that shows up in agricultural writing more than 2,000 years old. And the 5th piece is a thing so widely believed and so thoroughly wrong that Washington State University's Extension Service published an entire fact sheet for the specific purpose of talking American gardeners out of doing it every spring. None of these 7 faded because they quit working. They faded because there is no money in a shovel. That is not a conspiracy, neighbor. That is just arithmetic. A thing that costs nothing to do has nobody paying to remind you it exists. If you want the rest of what is in that ledger, subscribe. Not for me, because we drag one buried skill back into the light at a time here, and you are going to want the next one. Piece 1. The hole. Picture the old way of setting a tomato out. Not a hole, a trench. Your grandfather took a hoe and dug a shallow furrow 6 or 7 inches deep and 18 inches long, running with the row. Then he took that leggy transplant, the one that had gotten too tall and floppy on the windowsill, and he stripped every leaf off the bottom 2/3 of the stem with his thumb. Then he laid the whole plant down sideways in that trench, root ball at one end, and he curved the top 4 or 5 inches of leafy growth up out of the ground and propped it there with a clod of dirt. Then he buried the rest of it, stem and all. To a modern eye that looks like you have killed the plant. You have not. You have just multiplied it. Here is the botany, and this is not folklore. This is standard horticulture taught in every land-grant program in this country. Look closely at a tomato stem. It is covered in fine hairs. Those hairs sit on top of preformed root initials. A tomato is one of a small handful of garden plants that will throw adventitious roots out of its stem anywhere that stem meets moist soil. Bury 18 inches of stem and every inch of it becomes root. You have not planted a tomato. You have planted a root system with a tomato attached to the end of it. Now, why trench instead of just digging a deep vertical hole? Because in these mountains, and in most of the eastern half of this country, the warmth and the biology and the oxygen live in the top 8 inches of your soil. Go straight down 2 feet and you are putting your roots in cold, dense, dead ground in the middle of May, and the plant will sulk for 3 weeks. Lay it sideways at 6 inches, and you get all that root, and you keep it in the living layer. Your grandfather did not know the word rhizosphere. He knew the plants he laid down beat the plants he stood up every year, and he wrote it in the book. Extension horticulturists across the country still recommend exactly this. Deep setting or trench setting of tomato transplants, lower leaves removed, is in the standard guidance. It has never been retracted, never been improved on, and it has never once been advertised, because there is no product in it. So here is your job this week. If your plants are already in the ground and standing up straight and shallow, you can still fix it. Mound soil up the stem 4 to 6 inches on both sides, a good firm hill, and water it in. You will get stem rooting out of the buried section within about 2 weeks. It is not as good as trenching from the start. It is a great deal better than nothing. Next, what actually goes in that trench before the plant does? and I am going to name the two things nearly everybody puts in there that do not work, and tell you exactly why, with the institution that says so. Piece 2. The bottom of the trench. Your great-grandmother put three things in the bottom of a tomato trench, and none of them came out of a bag. The first was well-rotted manure or finished compost, not fresh, and this matters. Fresh manure and heavy nitrogen give you a magnificent green plant that is 5 feet tall by the 4th of July and carries about 9 tomatoes. Excess nitrogen pushes vegetative growth at the direct expense of fruit set. That is settled. It is in every extension bulletin on tomato culture, and it is the single most common way a beginner wrecks a good patch while trying hard. The second thing was a scattering of hardwood ashes out of the stove. Now be careful here, and let me be straight with you, because this is where an old practice needs a modern guardrail. Wood ash is genuinely useful. It carries potassium and it carries calcium carbonate, which raises soil pH. And our mountain soils here, weathered acidic ground under a hardwood canopy for 10,000 years, tend to run sour. A tomato wants to sit somewhere around 6.2 to 6.8 on the pH scale, and a great many Appalachian gardens sit well below that. But ash acts as a liming agent, and you can absolutely overshoot it. Your grandmother had a lifetime of feedback on one patch of ground. You do not. So get a soil test through your county extension office, which in most states costs less than a bag of the fertilizer you were going to buy anyway. And let the number tell you. A handful per hill, not a bucket. The third thing was depth of loose soil underneath, forked up and broken, so the roots had somewhere to go down into instead of hitting a pan. Now here are the two things half of America puts in that hole every single May that do essentially nothing for this year's crop. Crushed eggshells. The theory is calcium, and the target is blossom end rot, that black, leathery, sunken patch on the bottom of the fruit. It is a reasonable theory, and it is wrong on the timing. Eggshells are calcium carbonate locked in a hard crystalline matrix, and university extension work, including guidance out of Utah State and North Carolina State, is consistent on this point. They break down far too slowly to change plant-available calcium inside the 90 days your tomato is actually growing. Crushed shell in a spring hole is a soil amendment for the year 2029. And the second one, Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate. Half the gardening advice in this country tells you to throw a tablespoon of it in the hole for bigger fruit and no rot. Washington State University's Extension Service published a fact sheet specifically taking this apart because it is not merely useless in most gardens, it can work against you. Magnesium and calcium compete for uptake at the root. If you are dumping magnesium into a soil that was not short of magnesium to begin with, you can make calcium uptake worse, which means you can make blossom end rot worse while believing you are curing it. Because here is the thing about blossom end rot that changes everything, and it is the hinge this entire video turns on. Blossom end rot is almost never a shortage of calcium in the soil. Your soil has plenty. It is a failure to move calcium into the fruit, and calcium moves in water. It rides the transpiration stream. It has no other way to get there. So when the water supply to that plant surges and starves, the calcium does not arrive on time, and the cells at the far end of the fruit, farthest from the stem, collapse and go black. Blossom end rot is a plumbing problem wearing a nutrition costume. Radiator Charlie would have understood that in about 4 seconds. Nobody hid that from you. There is simply no money in telling a man his problem is a bucket and a schedule when you could sell him a jar. This week, if you have already put shells and salts in your holes, no harm done and no guilt owed. Just do not count on them. Put your money and your effort into the next piece instead. Piece 3. The buried vessel. This is the one I promised you. And it is old, older than anything else on this list. Your great-grandmother, when she set out a hill of tomatoes, buried something beside it. On the ridges here it was often a cracked crock or a clay flower pot with the drain hole plugged, sunk to the rim so only the lip showed above the dirt. Farther out it was a coffee can with nail holes punched around the bottom. The principle is identical. You are not watering the surface. You are delivering water directly to the root zone below the crust, where the sun cannot take it back. The unglazed clay version of this has a name. It shows up in agricultural writing in China, more than 2,000 years old, and it has been used continuously across North Africa and the Middle East ever since, because it is the most water-efficient irrigation ever devised by anybody. Unglazed fired clay is slightly porous. Fill the buried pot, and it will seep water out through its own wall at a rate governed by how dry the surrounding soil is. Wet soil, it slows down. Dry soil, it speeds up. There is no timer, no valve, no electricity, and no evaporation loss, because none of that water ever touches air. Steady. That is the word again. That is the whole thing. You do not need to import an antique. Take a 1-gallon plastic jug. Burn or drill 6 or 8 small holes in the lower third. Cut the bottom off a 2-liter bottle and invert it. Or use a piece of 2-inch pipe cut 18 inches long with holes down the buried end. Sink it 8 to 10 inches deep, 6 inches out from the stem, at planting time so you do not cut roots later. Fill it when you go by. That single change does more for fruit size in a dry August than every amendment sold in a garden center. And here is the discipline that goes with it, the part that is actually hard. Deep and infrequent beats, shallow and daily, every time. A light sprinkle every evening trains roots to stay at the surface waiting for it, and the day you miss, the plant crashes. A heavy soak twice a week drives roots down after the water. A tomato root system, given permission, will go 4 feet down and better. 4 feet down is where the water still is in the 3rd week of a drought. Surface sprinkle, shallow roots, dead in a dry spell. Deep soak, deep roots, indifferent to weather. That is the trade, and it is not close. Do this on Saturday. Sink a vessel beside every plant you have. It will take you 20 minutes, and it is the closest thing to insurance a garden has. Now, everything up to this point, your great-grandmother could have walked you through in one afternoon with a shovel. From here on, we are into the parts where the modern garden actually gets beaten, and where I have watched more good patches die on this ridge than from any drought. Piece 4. The line. Walk out to your tomatoes in the 2nd week of July and look at the very bottom leaves. If you see small dark spots with pale centers, ringed, spreading upward leaf by leaf until the plant is bare from the knees down, you are looking at septoria leaf spot or early blight. And I want you to understand where it came from, because it is not what people assume. It did not blow in. It did not come off your neighbor's plants. It came up. It lives in your soil, in last year's tomato debris, and it gets onto your plant when a raindrop hits bare dirt and splashes it 3 inches up onto the lowest leaf. From that leaf it walks the plant, which means the entire defense is a physical barrier between soil and leaf. That is all it is. So, 3 moves. First, mulch. 3 to 4 inches of straw. Shredded leaves or grass clippings laid down thick right after the ground has warmed. That stops the splash cold and, not incidentally, it is also the single best thing you can do to hold moisture steady, which takes us right back to piece 3. 1 handful of straw is doing 2 jobs. Second, take the lowest 12 inches of foliage off the plant entirely once it is established. No leaf, nothing to splash onto. Third, rotate. Do not plant tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, or eggplant in the same ground 2 years running. Those are all the same family, and they all host the same troubles. 3 years off that ground is the standard guidance. 4 is better. Your great-grandfather rotated because he had room and he had noticed. You may only have 1 bed, and if so, be honest about it and be twice as strict about the mulch and the sanitation. And one more thing. And this one is specific to this part of the country in a way that almost nothing else on the list is: tobacco mosaic virus. Tobacco and tomato are close relations, and this ground grew tobacco for 200 years. The virus survives in cured tobacco, and extension services warn plainly that a person who has been handling tobacco can carry it on their hands directly to a tomato plant and infect it. If you use tobacco in any form, wash your hands with soap and water before you touch a tomato plant. That is a free instruction. It has saved more plants in these mountains than any spray ever sold. Piece 5. The cut and the sucker you keep. In the crotch where a leaf branch meets the main stem, a tomato grows a third shoot. Everyone calls it a sucker, and whether you take it off depends entirely on one thing that nobody at the garden center will ask you. Is your plant determinate or indeterminate? It is on the tag. Determinate varieties grow to a genetically fixed height, set their fruit in a concentrated wave, and finish. Those are your canning tomatoes and your paste tomatoes. Do not prune a determinate hard. Every sucker you remove is fruit you deleted permanently because the plant is not going to make more. Indeterminate varieties, which is most heirlooms and nearly every old Appalachian variety worth having, vine indefinitely until frost kills them. Those you prune, and here is the rule your grandfather used. Take every sucker below the first flower cluster, without exception, because those are the ones that build a jungle at ground level and destroy your airflow and guarantee you the disease we just discussed. Above that first flower cluster, thin as you see fit to keep the plant open to light and moving air. But do not get carried away. An over-pruned tomato exposes fruit to direct sun and you get sun scald, a pale leathery patch on the shoulder that ruins the tomato. Leaves are shade. The plant knows what it is doing. You are editing, not clear-cutting. Now here is the part almost nobody does anymore, and it is free money. Do not throw those suckers in the compost. A sucker is a tomato stem, and we established in Piece 1 what a tomato stem does when you put it in moist ground. Take a sucker 4 to 6 inches long, strip the bottom leaves, stand it in a jar of water on a windowsill out of hard sun, and inside 7 to 14 days it will grow its own roots. Plant it out. It is a genetically identical copy of the parent plant, free. And if you take them in early summer, you will have a second wave of plants coming into production in late August when your originals are getting tired. The old people did a version of this with a willow. Soak willow twigs in water and root cuttings in that water. There is real chemistry underneath the folk practice. Willow tissue contains indolbutyric acid, which is in the same family as the compound sold as commercial rooting hormone. I am not going to tell you it works as well as the bottle. I am telling you your great-grandmother was not guessing at random. She was reading results across 40 years. Piece 6. The shake. This one costs nothing, takes 4 seconds, and I would guess fewer than one gardener in 20 in this country knows it. A tomato flower is what botanists call perfect. It has both parts. It does not need another plant, and it does not, strictly speaking, need an insect. But the pollen inside a tomato flower is held in a tube, and it will not fall out on its own. It has to be shaken loose. Out in the world, that job is done by bumblebees, who grip the flower and vibrate their flight muscles at a frequency that shakes the pollen free. That is called buzz pollination. Honeybees cannot do it. They physically do not have the technique. This is not an obscure academic point. The commercial greenhouse industry has run on it for decades. Before bumblebee colonies became the standard, greenhouse growers walked the rows with handheld electric vibrators touching every flower cluster, because without that vibration, a greenhouse tomato sets almost nothing. So when your plant is loaded with blooms in June and you are getting flowers but no fruit, walk out mid to late morning when the humidity has dropped and flick each flower cluster hard with your finger, or give the stake a good sharp rap. That is it. That is the whole technique. Do it every 2 or 3 days through bloom, and know when it is not your fault. Tomato pollen loses viability in extreme heat. When daytime temperatures run above roughly 90 degrees and, more importantly, when nighttime temperatures stay above the middle 70s, the pollen goes sterile and the flowers drop. That is the July stall. Nothing you buy will fix it. What helps is shade cloth, or a temporary screen over the patch in the worst 2 weeks, and heavy mulch keeping the root zone cool, and patience, because when nights break in late August, the plant will set again. While we are out here, one more thing. If you find a hornworm, that big green caterpillar, covered in what look like grains of white rice standing up off its back, do not kill it. Those are the cocoons of a brocconid wasp, a parasitoid that lays eggs inside hornworms. That caterpillar is already finished, and when those cocoons hatch, you get a squadron of wasps that will hunt every other hornworm in your patch for free. Leave it right where it is. That is a piece of pest control the old-timers understood by observation a century before anybody wrote the Latin name down. Now, everything to this point is technique. What is left is the piece that decides whether any of it belongs to you. Piece 7. The seed. In 1990, an envelope arrived at the house of a man named Craig LeHoulier in North Carolina. It had been mailed by John Green of Sevierville, Tennessee. Inside was a small quantity of tomato seed and a note explaining that the seed had come down through Cherokee gardeners, and that families in that part of East Tennessee had been growing it for something on the order of 100 years. He grew it out. Dusky rose-shouldered fruit with green shoulders, thin-skinned, and a flavor that stopped people in their tracks. He named it Cherokee Purple. He offered it through the Seed Savers Exchange yearbook the following year, and it went into a commercial catalog in 1993. Today it is one of the most widely grown heirloom tomatoes on this continent, in gardens on every inhabited continent on Earth. That entire variety survived 100 years on nothing but ordinary people scooping seed out of a tomato and putting it in an envelope. It had no patent, no corporation, no research budget, no marketing. It had grandmothers. And it came within one generation of vanishing completely, because that is what happens to an heirloom when one link in the chain does not get taught how. Seed Savers Exchange itself started the same way, founded in 1975 by Diane Ott Wheely and Kent Wheely after her grandfather handed her seed his family had carried from Bavaria in the 1880s and told her it was hers to keep going. From that one handoff came an organization now maintaining tens of thousands of varieties. So here is how you do it, and here is the step that everybody skips. Pick your best fruit, not the first, not the biggest necessarily, but the one off the healthiest plant that tastes the way you want next year to taste. Let it get dead ripe, riper than you would eat it. Cut it across the middle and squeeze the gel and seed into a jar. Add a splash of water. Set the jar on the counter and leave it 2 to 4 days, stirring once a day. It will grow a film of mold on top and it will smell bad. That is the point. That gel around each seed is a germination inhibitor, and it exists so the seed will not sprout inside the fruit. Fermentation strips it off, and it does something else that matters just as much. That short ferment reduces several seed-borne bacterial diseases, which is why the practice is not a quaint old habit but standard recommended procedure in extension seed-saving guidance to this day. After the ferment, add water, stir, and pour off. The dead seed and pulp float, the good seed sinks. Repeat until the water runs clear. Spread on a plate or a screen, not paper towel, and dry in shade with air moving for a week. Then into a labeled envelope and into a sealed jar somewhere cool and dark, kept dry. Tomato seed will still come up strong 4, 5, 6 years down the road. 2 rules and you are done. Save only from open-pollinated or heirloom varieties. Save from a hybrid, one labeled F1, and next year's plants will not resemble the parent, because a hybrid is a first-generation cross and it does not breed true. That is not a defect and it is not a trick played on you. Hybrid tomatoes are genuinely excellent. Burpee released Big Boy in 1949, and it earned every bit of its reputation. But by their nature you have to buy them again every year, and that is exactly the difference we are talking about. And here is the law, plainly and accurately, because I promised you I would name it. The Plant Patent Act of 1930 established patent protection for asexually reproduced plants. The Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 extended a form of protection to seed-propagated varieties. In 2001, the Supreme Court confirmed in JEM Ag Supply against Pioneer Hybrid that plants can be covered by full utility patents. And in 2013, in Bowman against Monsanto, the Supreme Court held unanimously that a farmer could not use a patented seed to grow a new crop without permission from the patent holder. Now hear me exactly. Nobody has outlawed your tomato. Saving seed from an heirloom variety in your own garden for your own use is a perfectly ordinary thing to do, and people do it by the million. What changed is the default. Inside about 80 years, the American household went from a place where seed was something you kept to a place where seed is something you purchase, and the knowledge of how to keep it stopped being handed down because it stopped being needed. There was no raid, there was a catalog. So let me give you the whole thing back in one piece. You dig a trench, not a hole, 6 inches deep and long enough to lay the plant down. You strip the bottom 2/3 of the leaves off. You bury manure that has finished rotting, and a light scatter of hardwood ash if your soil test says your ground is sour. You lay the plant sideways, curve the top out, and bury the stem, and every inch of that buried stem becomes root. You sink a vessel with holes in it beside the plant on the same day, and from then on you water deep and infrequent, never shallow and daily. You mulch 4 inches thick, and you strip the lowest foot of foliage so the soil can never splash a leaf. You rotate the ground 3 years. You wash your hands with soap before you touch the plant if you have handled tobacco. You prune below the first flower cluster on an indeterminate, and you leave a determinate alone, and you root the suckers you took in a jar of water for free plants. You flick the flower clusters mid-morning through bloom. You forgive the plant for July. And when the best fruit off the best plant comes in dead ripe, you cut it across the middle, ferment the seed 4 days, rinse it, dry it in the shade, and put it in an envelope with a date on it. That is the whole method. Nothing in it costs more than a shovel and a jar. And this was never really about tomatoes, was it? A man who can grow food and keep the seed to grow it again is holding a different position in the world than a man who can grow food only as long as somebody sells him the start of it every March. That is not doom talk, and I am not selling you fear. The stores are open, the catalogs are fine. The only thing that went missing is the part of you that could have done it without them, and that part is not gone, it is just untrained. So do not try to do all 7 this weekend. Do 1. This Saturday. Go out and sink a vessel beside every tomato you have and give it a deep soak. That is 20 minutes, and it will change your August. Then in September, when the best one on the vine comes ripe, cut it across the middle and start a jar on the counter. I have got a page in Amos's ledger from the summer of 1954, a dry year, where he wrote down the trench depth on every row and the yield off every plant. He was arguing with himself about 4 inches versus 7, 7-1. He underlined it. That is what 100 years of gardening on one ridge actually looks like. Not magic, just a man writing down what happened and refusing to forget it. Tell me down below. Did your grandmother save tomato seed? Did she ferment it in a jar on the windowsill? Or did she just dry it on newspaper? Did your people lay the plants down in a trench or stand them up? Different hollers did this different ways, and the method that shows up most in the comments is the one I take apart in full next. Next time on this channel, the pole bean your great-grandmother strung on a porch line and dried into something the mountains called leather breeches, a preservation method that fed families through winters when there was no cash and no can, and the exact decade the commercial canning industry made sure your grandmother stopped teaching it. Plant deep. Save the seed. That is how a garden stays yours.